Welcome everyone to today's story. Kicked out at 14 by my stepmother, my father and I survived winter in an abandoned bus. But don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is. Now let's get into the story. The day my stepmother kicked us out is etched into my memory like a permanent scar. It was a bitterly cold morning in late autumn. The sky a dull gray that mirrored the heaviness in my chest. I was only 14. A fragile kid trying to hold on to the fragments of a life that had already started to crumble. Our small apartment had been suffocating for years, filled with the tension of silent arguments, whispered threats, and the subtle but relentless pressure of a woman who made it clear that neither my father nor I were welcome unless we fit into the mold she had designed for her. Perfect family. That morning I remember walking into the kitchen, hoping for some small hint that things wouldn't escalate, but instead, the smell of burnt toast, mixed with the acidic tension of unspoken anger, filled the air. My stepmother's eyes were cold, sharp as the knife she used to slice vegetables for breakfast, though she ignored them entirely as she fixed her hair in the mirror. My father sat at the table, hunched over, his hands wrapped around a chipped mug of black coffee, the steam rising and mingling with the atmosphere of dread. "I've had enough," she said finally, her voice low, but carrying the weight of finality that made it impossible to respond. "You and your son have no place here anymore. Pack your things, leave now." I froze, 14 years old, and my entire world had just collapsed into those words. My father's lips trembled slightly, but he did not argue. His eyes met mine, a mixture of sorrow and helplessness that made my stomach knot. We had no money, no savings, no friends who could take us in. My father had a job that barely covered the rent, and even that was slipping through our fingers under her. Manipulations and constant interference, and now the final door had closed. We packed what little we could carry into worn-out backpacks. I stole one last look around the apartment, a place filled with shadows of memories, both good and bad, that would now belong to someone else. The door slammed behind us, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the hollow space of my chest. We were on the streets, not entirely homeless yet, but perilously close. Our destination became the only refuge we could imagine, an old-school bus parked behind a rundown warehouse, abandoned and rusting, its yellow paint faded and peeling. The bus had been left there for months, maybe years. It was a skeleton of what it once was, a vehicle that had carried children through school routes and laughter, now silent and waiting. My father had found it earlier that year while wandering through empty lots on his meager days off, and in some strange twist of fate, it had become our temporary home. The first night inside the bus was bitter and unforgiving. The metal walls conducted the cold like a living thing, wrapping around us and seeping into our bones. We huddled together on the cracked vinyl seats, trying to make sense of our new reality. My father did his best to make it feel like a home. He covered gaps in the windows with old blankets, stuffed straw and cardboard along the edges of the floor to create some insulation, and even managed to rig a small, gas-powered heater that groaned and coughed like a dying animal. But despite his efforts, the chill was relentless. I remember my teeth chattering so hard I thought they might break, and my father's hands trembling as he tried to warm them with his own. Days passed, each one blending into the next with a monotony of struggle. We scavenged for food, sometimes lucky, enough to find cans in the dumpster behind the grocery store, sometimes forced to rely on the generosity of strangers, who gave more out of pity than kindness. Each day I learned how to survive on scraps, how to ration water, and how to ignore the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. The bus became our fortress, a small, claustrophobic space that somehow managed to keep the worst of the cold out. But only just. It was strange how life adjusted to hardship when you had no choice. The world outside the bus seemed endless and indifferent. Children my age went to school, played in parks, and laughed without care, while we huddled in corners of the city, invisible to almost everyone. I learned to move quietly, to blend into shadows, to make myself small and unnoticeable. I became hyper-aware of every sound, the footsteps of strangers walking past, the bark of distant dogs, the screech of brakes as buses and cars rumbled down nearby streets. Every noise could be a threat, but every day we survived was a small victory. Despite the harshness of our circumstances, there were moments of fragile beauty. I remember watching the sun rise through the frost-covered windows, the light glinting off icicles forming along the edges of the bus roof. My father, despite everything, would hum quietly to himself as he fixed our meager meals on the small, sputtering stove. Sometimes, when the wind was low and the world outside was calm, We would sit together on the roof of the bus, wrapped in tattered blankets, and talk about the life we used to have, or the life we hoped to build. Those moments felt sacred, like tiny sparks of warmth in the endless cold. But the world was not kind, and reality pressed in relentlessly. The cold seeped into our bones, and the days grew shorter. I had learned to be vigilant at night, keeping one ear tuned to every sound outside, every shadow that moved across the walls of the bus. I learned to ration our food carefully, to stretch a single can of beans into 2 meals, and to drink water sparingly. Hunger became a constant companion, a dull ache that never went away but became part of the rhythm of our days. The hardest moments, though, were not the cold or the hunger. They were the silent ones. When I watched my father try to maintain his dignity in the face of everything we had lost, he would stare out the small frosted windows, hands clasped, jaw tight, as if willing the world to be different. And I, powerless to change our fate, would sit beside him offering what comfort I could. Sometimes we didn't speak at all, and the silence itself was a form of communication, a bond that reminded us that we were still together. It was during those nights, lying on the cold floor of the bus with my father's arm draped protectively over me, that I realized something important. Survival was not just about finding food or staying warm. It was about holding on to the fragile threads of hope that connected us to each other. Every day we survived, despite the odds, became a testament to resilience. And even though I was only 14, I began to understand that life would not wait for us to feel ready. We had to fight every day with whatever we had. The bus, once a symbol of abandonment, had become our sanctuary. Its peeling paint and rusted edges were now a shield against the indifference of the world. Inside, we had carved out a small space that belonged to us, a place where we could exist without judgment. I swept the floor, organized our sparse belongings, and kept watch at night, learning skills that other kids my age would not even imagine needing. The city outside continued its rhythm, oblivious to the 2 lives surviving in a broken-down vehicle, but inside we found moments of control, of agency however small. And yet the harsh truth never left me. We were vulnerable. Every day a new threat loomed: thieves, harsh weather, illness, exhaustion. The bus, for all its protection, was fragile. The heater could fail, the windows could break, the wind could find its way through tiny cracks and pierce our defenses. But we endured, driven by necessity and the silent understanding that if we gave up, there would be no one to care for us. As the weeks passed, our bodies hardened to the cold. Our minds sharpened to the dangers outside, and our bond grew stronger. I watched my father with a mixture of admiration and sorrow. He was a man broken by circumstance, yet unbowed, trying to teach me lessons of resilience and dignity even as we struggled. And though I hated the woman who had forced us into this life, I knew that every hardship had forged a strength in us that would never have existed otherwise. By the time the first snow fell, coating the bus and the streets in a blanket of white, we had established a fragile routine. Days were spent scavenging and preparing, nights huddled together in the cramped space of the bus, whispering stories, making plans, and dreaming of a future that seemed impossibly distant. The city around us carried on, unaware of the small acts of survival taking place in a yellow, rusted shell at the edge of forgotten lots. And so I learned the first of many harsh truths. The world is indifferent. Survival is a skill, and sometimes family is not defined by blood or circumstance, but by who stands beside you when everything else abandons you. In the back of that bus, shivering against the creeping cold and hunger, I began to grow, not just older, but tougher, wiser, and more aware of the fragile, precarious beauty of life. Even at 14, with the weight of the world pressing down on my small shoulders, I realized that life had given me a choice: despair or resilience. And in that moment, I chose to fight. Winter came faster than I expected, like a thief in the night, sneaking through the city streets and turning everything familiar into a frozen wasteland. The first flakes fell silently, so small and innocent that I almost smiled, but it didn't last. Within hours, the flakes turned into thick, relentless snow, blanketing the city in white. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a living, breathing enemy. Every gust of wind felt like knives slicing through the thin layers of clothes my father and I wore. Even inside the bus, where we had carved out our tiny sanctuary, the chill crept through the windows and floorboards, making our breath visible in the dim light. We had tried to prepare. My father stuffed extra blankets into every crack, patched the holes in the windows with cardboard and tape, and kept the small gas stove running as much as it could without running out of fuel. But winter did not care about our preparations. The nights were endless, dark, and unforgiving. I remember one night particularly, when the wind shrieked like a living thing, rattling the metal walls of the bus. My fingers and toes felt like ice blocks, and my teeth chattered so violently I thought they might break. I could hear my father muttering under his breath, a mantra of survival that I didn't yet understand, as he tried to keep the heater alive, coaxing it with careful nudges and whispers. Outside, the city was almost unrecognizable. Streets that had once buzzed with cars and pedestrians were now buried under snow, and the cold had driven almost everyone indoors. I caught glimpses of people huddled in doorways, wrapped in layers of rags, their faces pale and frozen, moving cautiously like ghosts. It was hard not to notice how fragile life had become for anyone without a home. Every day I saw signs of people succumbing to the cold, abandoned tents, empty shopping carts, and the occasional discarded glove or boot frozen stiff in the snow. My heart clenched each time I realized someone hadn't made it through the night. Inside the bus, survival became an endless routine of vigilance. Every day my father and I had to check the stove, scrape frost from the windows, and ration what little food we had left. Cans of beans and soup became treasures. Each meal stretched across hours of waiting and careful division. Water froze quickly in the small containers we had, so we had to melt snow whenever possible. A tedious and exhausting task that reminded us constantly how desperate our situation had become. Hunger gnawed at us like a persistent animal, but we learned to push through it. Our bodies grew leaner, muscles taut from constant movement, our skin dry and cracked from the cold. I became aware of every ache, every shiver, every pang of weakness, yet still we survived. The nights were the hardest. Darkness came early, and with it came silence, and the isolation of being trapped in a metal shell while the world outside froze. My father would sit beside me on the bus floor, holding me close, whispering stories of when he was my age. Sometimes he told me about his own childhood, about summers that felt endless and winters that weren't this cruel. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the worry he felt. I learned to read his expressions, to know when he was afraid even if he didn't say a word. We had each other, and in that knowledge I found strength I didn't know I had. One night, the storm reached its peak. The wind tore through the city, making the bus groan like a trapped animal. I lay awake listening to the metal bend and twist, imagining it could collapse at any moment. Snow piled up against the bus, forming drifts so high that we had to shovel just to keep the door accessible. The heater sputtered and coughed, gasping for warmth, and I held my father's hand, feeling his grip tighten with every shiver that ran through us. I thought we might not make it through that night, and for the first time, I truly understood fear, not the fear of school bullies or angry adults, but the fear of the world itself, indifferent and merciless. Yet despite the chaos, there was a strange beauty. I remember looking out through a small patch of window that my father had cleared of frost. The city was transformed into a silent wonderland. Streetlights glowed like soft orbs through the falling snow, and the flakes danced in the golden light, creating a surreal, almost magical world. It was impossible not to be captivated, even as the cold bit into my face. It reminded me that life was not just suffering, it was fleeting moments of wonder too, glimpses of beauty even in the harshest of conditions. But the danger outside never left us. We weren't the only ones struggling. Some nights people wandered too close to the bus looking for shelter or food. Once a group of men tried to peer through the windows, eyes wide and desperate. My father, without a word, moved to block them, his presence enough to make them hesitate before they shuffled away into the snow. I realized then that the bus was our fortress, but also a fragile barrier against the cruelty and desperation of the world. One misstep, one broken lock, one exhausted moment, and everything could be lost. Illness became another silent enemy. The constant cold, the lack of proper food, and the exposure made us vulnerable. I felt fevers creep up, my body trembling uncontrollably even under blankets. My father, though worn and exhausted himself, did his best to nurse me back, using old remedies and careful attention. There was no doctor to call, no hospital to turn to. We were alone, completely dependent on each other and the small supplies we could scavenge. Every time I felt the heat of the fever break, I counted it as a victory, a momentary reprieve in the unrelenting battle for life. Hunger, cold, fear, and exhaustion became part of a rhythm we adapted to. I learned to wake before dawn, scraping frost from the windows, and making a fire to take the edge off the morning cold. We scavenged whatever food we could, often walking for miles in the snow, eyes stinging from the wind, cheeks numb and raw. Each small victory, a can of beans, a dry blanket, a sunny hour, was celebrated quietly, a small defiance against the winter that sought to claim us. But the real test came when we saw the aftermath of the storm on the streets. Bodies huddled under cardboard, abandoned pets stiff in the snow, tents collapsed under the weight of ice. Life had been merciless to everyone else. The bus, by some miracle or stubborn luck, had shielded us. We were cold, hungry, and exhausted, but alive. And as I watched the world around me suffer, a strange determination took hold. I realized that survival wasn't about luck alone. It was about attention, care, and refusing to give up. The bus wasn't just a shelter. It was a lesson in resilience, a fragile cocoon where hope could still exist. Inside, life became a series of routines and rituals. My father would rise before me to tend the stove, moving carefully so as not to wake me too early. We rationed food meticulously, sometimes making soup from the tiniest scraps and always conserving heat. Nights were filled with whispered stories, planning for the uncertain days ahead, and quiet moments of reflection. We shared everything from blankets to whispered encouragement, knowing that our survival depended entirely on our bond. Even in the worst moments, we found ways to laugh, to maintain our humanity. One night, after a particularly brutal day of scavenging, my father tried to make a small game of our frozen beans, tossing them across the bus and calling it bean hockey. I laughed so hard I nearly forgot how cold I was. Those moments reminded me that even in suffering, life could still hold joy, and even a rusting, cold bus could become a home when filled with love and determination. Weeks passed and the storm slowly relented. Snow melted unevenly, revealing streets still littered with the remnants of destruction. Many who had been caught unprepared had succumbed to the cold, leaving a silent, empty city behind. But the bus remained, battered but intact, its small inhabitants hardened and more aware of the fragile nature of life. We had survived when almost everyone else hadn't, not by chance, but through vigilance, care, and the bond that no storm could break. I remember standing on the roof of the bus one morning, the wind still sharp but the sun finally breaking through, and looking at the city that seemed both familiar and alien. I felt a strange mix of grief and gratitude. Grief for those who hadn't made it, and gratitude for the small miracles that had kept us alive. I realized that survival wasn't just about enduring the cold. It was about learning, adapting, and refusing to let the world define your fate. Winter had nearly killed everyone else, but it had forged something unbreakable in us. The bus, once a symbol of abandonment, had become a crucible of resilience. I was no longer just a 14-year-old boy forced into the streets. I was a survivor, a witness to life's fragility and strength. And my father, who had once seemed so powerless, had shown me that courage and love could create warmth even in the coldest, darkest nights. By the end of that winter, when the snow finally began to melt and the streets slowly revealed the scars left behind, I understood that life could be cruel, but it could also be survived. Every night spent shivering, every meal rationed. Every moment of fear had taught me lessons I would carry forever. The bus had saved us, yes, but it had also transformed us. We had learned that survival was not passive, it was active, intentional, and relentless. And as I looked out at the city, I knew that the world could be harsh, but we were ready to face it together. Spring arrived slowly, almost hesitantly, as if the world itself had to recover from the brutality of the winter. At first it was just hints, a soft warmth in the sun that touched the frost-bitten windows, the gentle trickle of melting snow down the gutters, and the faint smell of wet earth mixed with the decay of the past months. For my father and me, the change in seasons wasn't just weather. It was survival itself beginning to breathe again. The bus, which had been our fortress and our prison during winter, felt different. No longer were we huddled purely for warmth or shielding ourselves from deadly storms. The small heater that had groaned and sputtered through countless nights could finally rest. The blankets we had clutched like treasures could be folded and stored, and the windows, once encrusted with frost, let the sunlight pour in, illuminating the cracks, dents, and rust in the metal walls. I watched the light fall across the bus floor one morning and felt a strange mixture of relief and awe. After the months of endless snow, the world had survived, and so had we. The first weeks of spring were a delicate balancing act. The snowmelt left the streets slushy and muddy, making scavenging more difficult. Every outing became a careful navigation of puddles, ice patches, and debris, and yet, with each step, the weight of winter's terror began to lift, replaced by cautious optimism. I learned to appreciate the small victories in life. Finding a clean bottle of water, spotting a patch of dry ground, or sharing a warm meal with my father without worrying if we'd freeze by nightfall. Our bond, forged in the crucible of winter, had grown stronger than ever. The bus had become more than just a shelter. It was a home, a classroom, and a reminder of everything we had endured. My father and I spoke more freely now, sharing stories we had held back during the darkest nights, and making tentative plans for the future. The conversations were no longer whispers in fear, but declarations of intent. We had survived the worst, and we had done it together, yet the world outside remained fragile. I still saw those who had not been as fortunate, wandering through the streets with hollow eyes, searching for remnants of warmth, food, and hope. Some had lost friends, family, or even entire communities. Witnessing their struggle left a mark on me, a reminder that survival was not guaranteed, that every day was a gift, and that the resilience my father and I had developed was a rare, precious thing. It made me want to do more than just survive. It made me want to live, to honor what we had endured by striving for something greater. Food, once scarce, became slightly easier to find as the city reopened, but it remained a careful calculation. We continued to scavenge, to ration, and to plan every meal meticulously. My father began teaching me practical skills I had never imagined needing. How to purify water, how to identify edible plants along the empty lots, how to patch clothing and boots, how to cook with almost nothing. Each lesson was a step toward independence, a promise that the bus wouldn't be our home forever. I soaked up every word, every instruction, knowing that each skill might mean the difference between life and death if winter ever returned. With the thaw, nature itself seemed to encourage us forward. Patches of green began to appear between the snow and mud, and the smell of wet earth and budding flowers was intoxicating. Birds returned, singing from trees that had been bare for months, and the sunlight seemed warmer, less sharp, and more inviting. I remember standing on the roof of the bus one morning, feeling the sun on my face, and realizing for the first time in months that life was not just survival, it was possibility. It was a future we could shape. We also began to notice other signs of life returning. Small communities of homeless people emerged, forming tentative networks of support. At first, I watched them from a distance, wary of interaction, but my father encouraged me to connect, to share knowledge, and to be cautious yet compassionate. These interactions were sometimes tense, resources were still scarce, but they reminded me that humanity could persist, even in the harshest conditions. It wasn't a perfect world, but it was one where hope could exist. The bus itself became a symbol of transformation. What had once been a shelter against death now became a workshop, a place to repair, clean, and prepare for the next stage of our lives. My father fixed the broken seats, repainted patches of rusted metal, and even rigged a small garden on the roof with whatever soil and seeds he could find. Watching him work inspired a new kind of admiration. He was not just a survivor, he was a creator. A man determined to make life thrive, even in the smallest, most unlikely spaces. As spring progressed, the weather stabilized, and with it our courage. We ventured further from the bus, exploring streets and neighborhoods that had once felt too dangerous or too frozen. I learned to navigate the city not just for survival, but for opportunity. We discovered small libraries, community centers, and local organizations that provided food, clothing, and advice. It was a gradual awakening to the world outside the bus, a realization that life could extend beyond mere existence, and that there were pathways forward, however difficult. During this time, I began to reflect deeply on everything that had happened. The cruelty of my stepmother's rejection, the harshness of the winter, the near-death experiences, the hunger, the cold, all of it had forged a new version of me. I was no longer just a scared 14-year-old. I had become someone capable of endurance, problem-solving, and empathy. I understood fear, but I also understood strength. I learned that life could be cruel, but survival could be beautiful, especially when shared with someone you loved. My father and I started making tentative plans for the future. The bus, though still our home, would not remain so forever. We dreamed of a small apartment, a steady job, and a place where we could rebuild stability. I began to think about school again, realizing that education could be our bridge from survival to opportunity. These were ambitious dreams, But after surviving the winter that had claimed so many lives, anything seemed possible. We had faced the worst and lived. Surely we could face the rest. By late spring, we had not only survived, we had grown. The bus, once a symbol of abandonment and despair, had become a testament to resilience and determination. It had protected us when the world tried to destroy us, and within its walls we had discovered courage, ingenuity, and love. I realized that the hardships we endured had gifted us something no normal childhood could: the ability to face adversity without fear and to find hope even in desolation. The streets around us began to bustle again, filled with people returning to routines, unaware of the battles fought and won by those like us. I often stood on the roof of the bus, watching the world come back to life, and felt a quiet pride. We had survived when almost everyone else hadn't. We had endured hunger, cold, and fear, and we had emerged stronger. My father's hand on my shoulder reminded me that we were not alone. As the sun rose higher in the sky, warming the bus and the streets, I realized something profound. Life is not about avoiding hardship, but about embracing it, learning from it, and refusing to let it define you. We had been cast out at 14, forced into a harsh winter that could have ended us, but we had survived, and in surviving, we had become something greater, resilient, strong, and ready for whatever came next. And so, as the snow finally melted and spring's warmth spread across the city, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter what challenges lay ahead, I would face them with the courage and wisdom forged in the bus during the winter that had nearly killed everyone else. The story of that winter would never leave me, and neither would the bond with my father, who had been my anchor, my teacher, and my shield. Together we had endured the impossible, and together we would step into the world that awaited us, stronger, wiser, and unbroken.